Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume. The tax bill made it out of markup in the House Ways and Means Committee earlier this week and is headed to the House floor next week with a stop in the Budget Committee. Here to dig into the provisions is Pat Brown. Pat, welcome.
Great to be with you, Sindhu.
So last week we had a 28-page chairman's mark, and by Monday late afternoon we had a almost 400-page document, the tax bill. And so I'm assuming a few things changed in there. So
Yes.
could you start by talking about which provisions or what is in this bill that is a win for business?
So I'd say, Sindhu, the biggest win for business coming out of this, the chairman's mark released on Monday, is what's not in it. And by that, I mean there was a lot of talk, obviously, in the days and weeks leading up to the release of the text on Monday about what corporate revenue raisers we might see in this bill. And, included in that, of course, there was discussions about limitations on the deductibility of state and local taxes for corporations, restrictions or increases rather in the excise tax on stock buybacks or other similar measures that we'd heard about. Maybe there was even talk about some changes in the international rules that could toughen those rules in some respects. We saw none of that in the bill. And so the fact that none of that was in there is a very big deal for businesses. I think probably the single biggest highlight for a lot of businesses are the things that they were worried they might see, but that they didn't see. The second thing I would point to is the fact that the House clearly wanted to send a signal that they are maintaining the foundational elements of the international provisions of the TCJA on a permanent basis going forward. So the FDII rate is maintained at its current level on a permanent basis. The GILTI rate is maintained on its current level on a permanent basis. The BEAT, which was scheduled to get worse next year, both with respect to the rate and the method of computation, those changes are eliminated going forward on a permanent basis. So those are all very positive things as well. And again, clearly a desire on the part of the House to send a signal to business to say, hey, we understand that business craves certainty for investment decisions and planning decisions. And that's what we're trying to deliver with this bill with respect to these key foundational elements of the international rules. And then the third thing I would point to is the fact that we sometimes refer to these as these TCJA orphan provisions. The deductibility of R&D expense under Section 174, the calculation of Section 163 interest limitations on an EBITDA basis rather than an EBIT basis, and of course, expensing of new equipment, accelerated depreciation or expensing of new equipment. Those were all added back into the law, or will all be added back into the law by this bill, to be sure, not on a permanent basis, but on a 5-year basis, which is a significant win for business as well. Getting those things put back into the law will be a significant win as well. So I really point to those three things as the biggest wins for business.
So I know with wins, there have to be some trade-offs. And in the conversations that I've had this week, people have constantly been bringing up the word, well, there are nuances here. So let's talk about the nuanced trade-offs for businesses.
Yeah, so there are a couple of things I would point to, Sindhu, but probably the single biggest one that I would point to is the Inflation Reduction Act incentives took a pretty significant hit in this bill. So a number of provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act, these green energy incentives that were adopted by the Congress and the Biden administration in 2022, a number of them were eliminated completely. Several others have been scaled back or phased out on a different timeline. And that obviously is going to have different effects on different companies, depending on to what extent they were taking advantage of those incentives or making use of those incentives. So that's a very significant element of this that I would point to. The other thing that I would point to is, as with any bill of this size, there's a lot of detail in here. And so we're still working through things that are potentially in the bill and that could have an impact on folks. And I think, for example, there's a limitation of an increased limitation on the deductibility of charitable contributions for corporations in this bill. That caught a lot of us, including me, by surprise, and not necessarily something anybody had been talking about. But a lot of those kind of detailed provisions are things that people are still, frankly, working their way through and assessing the impacts to their particular company.
Okay. And I know, I imagine a lot of companies are wondering about, well, okay, when this gets to the finish line finally, what are the compliance and mitigation challenges? So what lies ahead for companies, let's say, if nothing changes from now until it potentially is signed into law?
Yeah, so to me, as much as anything else, Sindhu, it is really the fact that there are a whole lot of provisions in the bill. There's really almost like a laundry list of things that companies are going to have to go through and ask the question, what are the particular areas of my tax computation that will be affected? So I mentioned the charitable contribution thing. Probably not going to be a huge dollar amount for folks, but it changes the analysis and it changes the compliance that they're going to have to go through for that. So I think for a lot of that, I mean, the expression I would use into is more kind of rakes in the yard. What are the things that are buried in this bill that represent changes in my computation that I'm going to have to focus on going forward? If I were to pick out one area, I would go back to the Inflation Reduction Act incentives and ask the question about, okay, now to the extent there are investments that I was looking to make, that my company was looking to make, are these investments still going to be eligible for the incentive? How much has the computation changed? And how will that affect the economics of the deal? And how do I need to communicate that to management? Because that obviously is a big aspect of this. This is obviously something that's been talked about a lot. You're reading about it in major publications. You're seeing it on business news on television. If you're a CFO or CEO, okay, now we have text. How does a tax director manage all that, message all that stuff to management? And there's a lot to go through here.
All right. And you mentioned BEAT earlier, and I want to ask you if there are any enhancements or changes to FDII GILTI or BEAT, and either to enhance the benefit or fix known issues.
Yeah, so to some extent, Sindhu, this is one of the surprises in the bill. So we had been hearing, to be sure, that there was an effort on the part of the White House and as well as congressional tax writers to look at things like how can we enhance the benefit of FDII? Are there aspects of the BEAT that maybe don't make the BEAT work the way it was intended? And that should be addressed as part of this legislation. Look, you alluded to this earlier, Sindhu. We're at an early stage of this process, right? We've now come out of Ways and Means Committee. We go to the House floor next week. We do have this other chamber of Congress that we sometimes talk about, the Senate. They're going to want to weigh in on this as well. My sense, and obviously we don't know until the Senate actually tells us what they're going to do, is they maybe are looking at this with a sort of a little bit of a wider lens, maybe a little bit more ambition in terms of looking at some of these provisions and seeing whether or not there are ways to improve them in some way. So we're very early innings to figure out how these international provisions look. But I do think, going back to where we started, the fact that the House has said, or the House Ways and Means Committee anyway, has said, we want these provisions to carry forward in their current form on a permanent basis so that businesses have the certainty that we know they crave. That's a big deal. We're not done. And so we obviously need to see what will come out of the process going forward, particularly as we move over to the Senate, where, again, there may be more of a desire to look at these international provisions and ask how we can improve business.
So, Pat, we talked about Pillar 2 on an earlier episode. Talk about the fate of Pillar 2 in this bill.
Yeah, so the big question, Cindy, that we were looking to get an answer to with the chairman's release on Monday was, will Section 899 or something that looks like Section 899 be included in this bill? And the answer to that question is yes. And so Section 899, of course, was originally introduced by Chairman Smith back in 2023. It was reintroduced in January of 2025. It has been included in this bill. Now, it's been modified, and the modifications are interesting. So in this modified version of Section 899, the committee makes it very clear that the focus is very much on the undertaxed profits rule, the UTPR of Pillar 2, digital services taxes, and diverted profits taxes. So those three categories of taxes are named specifically in this bill. Prior iterations of the bill, the bill talked about extraterritorial taxes or discriminatory taxes, which were defined in a way that clearly seemed to encompass the UTPR and digital services taxes. But in this bill, they make it crystal clear. They call it out by name. These are the taxes that are in focus for the potential retaliation under Section 899. So that's one significant change in this reintroduced Section 899. Another significant change is in prior versions of Section 899, the application of the retaliatory taxes would apply, if I use the UTPR as an example, would apply to a country that had the UTPR in its domestic law. Well, the U.S. Treasury's current negotiating position, as we understand it with respect to Pillar 2, is not that countries need to eliminate the UTPR from their domestic law. They simply need to turn off the application of the UTPR as it would apply to US companies or foreign subsidiaries of US companies. This legislation essentially adopts Treasury's negotiating position into the text of Section 899. So you can clearly see very clear evidence that Treasury and the Ways and Means Committee are communicating with each other, making sure they're on the same page, so that the House is both signaling support for the elimination of the UTPR, digital services taxes, diverted profits taxes, but is also signaling a desire to ensure that they're on the same page with Treasury with respect to the negotiating position that Treasury is taking. So I think those are significant developments in this bill. Obviously, we'll see as the bill moves forward to the Senate how Section 899 is disposed of in the Senate side. But as we sit here today, a very clear signal to other countries to say the Article 1 branch, being the Congress, and the Article 2 branch, of course, being the executive branch, are aligned with respect to the need to see significant changes to Pillar 2, not just the need to see changes, but now really honing onto what those changes will be, what those changes are that other countries would need to make.
All right. And finally, you've sprinkled throughout this conversation tidbits where messaging perhaps for companies, but I really would like to know, what messaging are you conveying to companies, or what questions are you getting?
Yeah, so I think the message that I'm mostly giving to companies is, this is early innings. Things can still happen. Things can happen between now and the House floor next week. That we know that there are some aspects of the bill that was voted out of committee, not necessarily with respect to the corporate provisions directly, but for example, on the individual deductibility of state and local taxes, where everyone is reporting that there's going to need to be some changes to the bill that was voted out of committee before it is brought to the House floor. Well, if there are changes to that provision, will there be other changes that need to be made, potentially additional pay-fors that need to be introduced into the bill? We don't know the answers to any of those questions. So we are very early on in this process.
Pat, I'm really glad you brought that up. And thank you for all of this, for taking the time to talk.
Okay, thank you.
For more on the tax bill, you'll want to read PwC's Tax Insight, which is linked in the description of this episode, along with a registration link to a webcast on Monday about Pillar 2 challenges. We hope you'll join us for that and more on the tax bill. Take care.